all for joining us on the first of our calls this season to discuss the college football playoff rankings. It's great to be back together. As the chairman, I am honored to serve in this role, and it's an honor to spend the last 2 days with 12 college football experts. It's been great. I want to note that the committee does have 4 new members this year. We also have 9 returning members who have gone through this before. The new members did join us for the mock selection committee exercise, and all members are active participants in the debate over the last 2 days. I wish y'all could have been in the room. The debate over the top 25 rankings were extensive and very animated, particularly at the top. Case was made for Ohio State to be number 1, for Georgia, and for Tennessee. And there were good arguments for each one of the schools. At the end of the debate, the committee voted Tennessee number 1 because of their impressive road win at LSU and their victory over Alabama. And Alabama is a team that the committee respects highly. Ohio State is a powerful offense and a very solid defense. Impressive win last week over Penn State. Georgia's been dominant this season, which has been plain to see. In particular, the win over Oregon at the start of the season. But Tennessee's 2 wins against those 2 strong opponents really made a difference. As a reminder, the committee begins with no presumptions. Last year's record doesn't matter. The conference teams play in does not matter. We don't look at the polls. Our protocol is we consider the team's record, their strength of schedule, their head-to-head matchups, and the results of common opponents. The committee members make their rankings based on subjective expert college football judgment. They watch games. They have a wealth of data and statistics available, and the committee debates it all. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Boo. We'll now turn the call back over to Paul, the operator, to begin the question and answer segment of the call.
If you would like to ask a question, please press star 1 on your telephone keypad now. You'll be placed into the queue in the order received. Please be prepared to ask your question when prompted. Once again, if you have a question, please press star 1 on your phone now. And our first question comes from Trevor Groves. Your line is open.
Hi, Boo. Thanks for doing this, and it's good to talk to you for the first time. Just wanted to ask about Clemson being ranked number 4. That will surprise a lot of folks. ESPN's already voiced their surprise about that. But I believe the Tigers are number 4 strength of record with 3 ranked wins versus only 1 ranked win for Michigan and Ohio State. I'm sure that had something to do with it. But I wanted to ask you, I know the committee is supposed to consider and take into account injuries. How much do you discuss and will you continue to consider going forward the fact that Clemson beat NC State before Dennis Leary got hurt? Also, same with Syracuse. Schrader, as you know, was injured in the Notre Dame game the following week. But, as the NC State AD, I'm sure you're aware that was the Wolfpack were a legitimate top 10 team at the time that Clemson beat them, regardless of what, how they finished the season down the stretch. How much will you consider that as a part of the Tigers' resume?
Yeah, Trevor, thank you for the question. Injuries that do occur are part of the discussion. We don't project anything forward, but we deal with exactly the people that were on the field during the game. So again, to that point, if you're looking at a team that is at full strength and then loses someone later, you need to judge them on the men that were on the field at the time, during the game, and when the game was played.
Thanks, Boo.
Thank you. And our next question comes from Nicole Auerbach. Your line is open.
Yeah, thanks, Boo. My question is something you said during the television interview as you were talking about the committee liking balanced teams. Some of the teams in the top are very balanced, and others, maybe Tennessee is a good example of that, is not as balanced as some of the others. Why does balance matter to the committee as something you're looking for?
I think what we're looking at is the game itself and the dominance that can occur in the game with one side of the ball or the other. But overall, as we're looking at it, Nicole, really what we're looking at is statistically where they are, the football judgment of the committee to look at each team as they're playing. How do they handle unique situations from a Tennessee standpoint? You look at the LSU game and you look at the Kentucky game and the defensive effort by them in that game. I think that really stood out to the committee as we're looking at that. And, again, TCU's had a number of games that they've played where they really have had to come from behind. Timely defense, I think, is what we have talked about in the room, but that as far as that dominant standpoint, or that ability to dominate that side of one side of the ball or the other is really what was lacking.
Our next question comes from Nathan Beard. Your line is open.
Hi, I had a question about the two Big Ten teams that are at the relative top of your rankings. And I know you maybe didn't compare Ohio State and Michigan too much head-to-head. I guess they were 2 and 5, but both with similar resumes. The one ranked win over Penn State, both with a lot of comfortable wins this year. Can you explain why there's such a disparity in where those two teams are ranked right now?
I would say that the disparity is not that great in what we're doing with the rankings themselves. That may be a little bit of a misnomer, but when we looked at Ohio State, the explosiveness of their offense, averaging 49 points a game, winning games by an average of 32 points, I think that really stood out to the committee, like Michigan a lot. As a committee, more workmanlike, controlling their opponent. But again, I think there's a weaker non-conference schedule that was talked about before, and that was a part of the determination.
We have a question from David Ubben. Your line is open.
Boo, how would you describe the size of the gaps in the room between 1, 2, and 3?
A lively discussion. We made sure we went through and had advocates for each team to make sure that we were debating all the points of it, but in terms of specifics on what anything about it was. I mean, those were the 3 teams that separated themselves as time went on in the meeting yesterday. And we spent a great deal of time making sure that we got 1, 2, and 3 right, with the 2 wins by Tennessee being the determining factor.
And our next question comes from Mike Griffith. Your line is open.
Thanks, Boo. I wanted to ask about common opponents. We see that Georgia and Tennessee have both played Florida. Tennessee playing Florida at home, and Georgia recently winning more impressively at a neutral site over Florida. How do you factor in the transitive property, I guess, of them having a common opponent?
Yeah, I think it is part of our discussion as we go through it every week, and we make sure that we're guided by those principles overall. But as we looked at it, we saw the wins by Tennessee over Alabama and over LSU, even with Georgia's dominant win over Oregon, as being that much more to put them over the top.
And as a reminder, if you do have a question, please press star 1 on your telephone keypad. And our next question comes from Blake Topmeyer. Your line is open.
Hi, Boo. Good to talk to you. Question about TCU. TCU has 2 wins against teams in your top 18, and Alabama has no wins against teams in your top 20 plus a loss. What's the rationale for having Alabama ahead of TCU? And also, you've mentioned a couple times about TCU falling behind in games. How much stock is put into scores at the end of like the first quarter and the second quarter?
We're looking at the totality of the game as we go through it, but again, you're looking for that. You know, Alabama's got the dominant wins over Mississippi State, at Arkansas, the close win at Texas. Bryce Young missed the Texas A&M game, which was close, and again, TCU with the wins against Oklahoma State at home and Kansas State at home. Really good wins, really good team, but we felt like the defense struggled to keep points off the board at times, but it doesn't take away from the season they've had thus far.
And we have a question from David Teal. Your line is open.
Boo, good evening. Was it your sense of the room that what propelled Clemson into the top 4 were those ranked wins over NC State, Syracuse, and Wake Forest, and 4 road wins, as opposed to, I think, Michigan has only 2 road wins?
I think the collective of the group, David, is what it really is. It's not about reading the room or anything else, but as we go through it, and as we talk about certainly the wins, you know, at Wake, at Florida State, over NC State, over Syracuse, really did push them over the top. But again, there's 240 plus games still to be played this year. And you know, there's a lot of really good football in front of us.
Our next question comes from Bill Rabinowitz. Your line is open.
Hi, Boo. You mentioned Ohio State's explosive offense, and I think you said their defense was solid. I'd like to get a little more detail about what the committee thinks about Ohio State's defense, and how close was the discussion between Ohio State and Tennessee for number 1?
Again, I'll go back to, you know, there's a lot of really good football teams. There's a lot of really robust conversation going on. Ohio State's given up 17 points a game, and you know, scoring 44 points in their last 7 games. So again, it's a well-balanced team, and as we look at it, it was something that, you know, as a group, in the collective 13, really felt good about. Ohio State, but again, felt those 2 big wins by Tennessee is what ultimately carried the day.
And we have a question from Aaron McMahon. Your line is open.
Boo, you kind of touched on it earlier, but I'm wondering what the committee thinks of Michigan's resume and maybe what's keeping them out of the top 4.
Well, I think they're right there, Aaron, with in a larger picture. The signature win against Penn State, a well-balanced team, but at the end of it, when you look at that strength of schedule, it is something that we do talk about as one of the principles that guides us. And at this point in time, again, after week 9, we felt they were right in the number 5 position.
And our next question comes from Chip Towers. Your line is open.
Yeah, Boo, thanks for doing this. Just wondering, you know, specifically what was the most vigorous debate about where you settled on Georgia? And, you know, hearing you talk a lot about balance, most of the teams that ended up at the top aren't, you know, at the top of the nation when it comes to defensive play, while, Georgia and a couple others are. So is that what you mean about balance, being good on both sides of the ball, or what exactly was that vigorous debate that you referred to?
Yeah, I think it is what you said, right? I mean, it is about being good on both sides of the ball. Georgia is an exceedingly solid team that the committee really likes, and felt good about who they are. Obviously, the dominant win at the beginning of the season against Oregon turned a lot of heads. You know, their defense hasn't allowed a touchdown in the first quarter, which was part of our discussion as we're going through everything in the room. But again, there's a lot of really good teams at the top of the rankings right now, and you know where we are after week 9. And again, I hate to sound repetitive, but there's more games to be played.
And our next question comes from Heather Dinich. Your line is open.
Hey, Boo, you mentioned earlier that there were advocates for each of those 3 teams, Ohio State, Tennessee, and Georgia. I'm wondering, how exactly does that play out? Did that happen this week only because it was so close? Has that happened in the past? What is that like?
Well, again, as we go into the room, Heather, I mean, different people have different rankings. And as we're going through it, our goal is to come to a consensus and come to an agreement on where we are as a group. This isn't a force of personality or anything like that in the room. It really is about making sure that everyone in the room has an opportunity to speak and advocate for what they believe, and ultimately just to come to a collective decision on where we are as a group.
Okay, maybe I'm.
And our next question comes from Adam Sparks.
Sorry, Heather.
Your line is open.
Yeah, Boo, I'm wondering about what the committee's consideration is to close losses on the road to other top 10 teams. The obvious example is Alabama to Tennessee, but what kind of consideration are so-called good losses?
Well, I don't know that we talked specifically about good losses. Obviously, we're focused primarily on wins as we go through this, but to be able to play the game as late as they did into the game in a last-second field goal against, from a Tennessee standpoint, against Alabama to win it that way. Again, it's not a win in that sense, but again, it is a very competitive game, a well-played, a high-level game that's played. So, you know, as we're looking at everything that we do, wins obviously trump what we're doing, but, you know, as we look at a loss, we're going to look at everything about it.
And our next question comes from David Hood. Your line is open.
Hey, Mr. Corrigan. Yeah, I was going back to Clemson and Michigan at 4 and 5, and you were saying earlier that there was animated discussion in the room about the spots. Was there animated discussion about Clemson and Michigan? And, you know, finally, at the end of the day, I know you've touched on it a few times before, but what was maybe the 1 or 2 things that kind of allowed Clemson to slide into that 4 spot?
I think as you look at being 5-0 against teams that are over 500, Michigan is 2-0 against opponents that are over 500. That clearly is going to factor in, you know, a win at Wake Forest, a win at Florida State. As we're going through it, Michigan's win, signature win being the Penn State game. But again, all we can do is base it on where we are at this point in time.
And our next question comes from Scott Ritchie. Your line is open. Yeah, but I'm just curious how you evaluated a team like Illinois that's having something of a surprise season.
Well, I don't know that it's a surprise season. It's a season, right? You know, and it's based on the 2022 year. top scoring defense in the country, really competitive, 3 wins against teams above 500. That being said, we didn't know that there was necessarily a signature win associated with them, but a really good football team, a really tough football team.
Thank you. And as a final reminder, if you do have a question, please press star 1 on your touchtone keypad. And our next question comes from Angelique Chingelis. Your line is open.
Thank you, Boo. I'm sorry. I would have rescinded my opportunity here, but since you've been bombarded with Michigan questions, but you did mention in very fair descriptions of Ohio State being explosive and Michigan being workmanlike. That almost sounds like a negative. I mean, is that something that held against Michigan, the type of offense it is, and the way that they control opponents, as you said?
No, I don't think it's a negative at all. That they, to use that phrase, if you will, around it, because they've done a great job controlling their games and mixing the run with the pass. Really solid defense, good special teams. But again, as we're looking at this, with the margins in between, these are really good football teams, and it's our job to come up with a ranking on where it is. And this week, coming out of week 9, we saw them as a number 5 team.
Our next question is from Wilson Alexander. Your line is open.
Hey, Boo, just curious about LSU, where y'all have them ranked at number 10. What went into that, putting them as high as they are as a 2-loss team?
Well, I think in large part, the win over Mississippi, State, they did lose to Tennessee as well as to Florida State early in the season, but they seem to be getting better and better once Coach Kelly and the quarterback have kind of meshed a little bit, if you will, and we saw them coming off of that Mississippi win as being a team that was worthy of being in the top 10.
We have a question from Derek Peterson. Your line is open.
Hey, Boo, thanks for doing this. I had a question about Oregon. You guys have slotted at number 8. When you're looking at the Ducks, I guess, how do you balance how lopsided the first game was against Georgia with what they have done in the 7 weeks since that loss?
Yeah, well, good question. I think the win over UCLA has gone a long way. They've scored at least 41 points since that game. And they've really, with Bo Nix, has had a great season so far, along with so many other quarterbacks, right, as the season has gone on. And as we looked at it, obviously that initial game, but what they've been able to do since that time, I think has really turned the committee's head.
And we have time for 2 more questions. Our first question comes from Nicole Auerbach. Your line is open.
Yeah, I was just about to ask that exact Oregon question. So I'll switch gears. When you talk about Michigan's strength of schedule or like Oregon's week 1 loss, are these things that can be overcame by these teams as the season goes on? Like as Michigan, plays Ohio State later in the year, or as Oregon continues to improve? Are these things that they can offset fully in their resumes?
Well, I think the most important thing is as we look at this, we go into every week with a clean sheet, and this is where we are after week 9, and we'll come back next Monday and be able to go through the process again and scrub and re-scrub and debate and go through everything again. But our job is not to project forward on any of the teams with regards to players that may be out or those types of things. It's just to deal with the information we have to date on where we are. And again, a lot of really good teams and a lot of active conversation and debate.
And our last question comes from Brady McCullough. Your line is open.
Hey, Boo, thanks for doing this. I'm interested in the comparison and looking at USC and UCLA. Obviously, UCLA, handled Utah at home, and then USC lost at Utah in a really close game on the road. It's kind of the big common opponent there. It's ranked number 14, and USC's ranked at 9, and UCLA at 12. So I'm just curious how you guys viewed the Trojans and Bruin.
Both really good teams, dynamic offensively. As we looked at it, and the ability to put up points. I think the loss and how they lost UCLA, how they lost to Oregon, really was a topic of conversation. Had a good win coming back over Stanford this past weekend. Southern Cal wins at Arizona. Again, two of the top offenses in the country as far as scoring points, both over 40 points a game. And, to the previous question on, close losses and that side of it, what we're really doing is using our football judgment as a collective group and coming up with what we believe is the right decision.
And we have no further questions in queue.
Thank you.
That concludes our first selection committee call of the 2022 season. Again, as a reminder, the transcript of this will be on collegepressbox.com shortly.